In the summer of 1908, soldiers walked out of their barracks into the streets without orders. They were not deserting, they were celebrating. For the first time in 30 years, the constitution had been restored. Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and Jews embraced strangers in coffeehouses and on the waterfronts. In Constantinople, the Sultan's secret police burned their files. That morning felt, to everyone who lived through it, like the beginning of something. The Ottoman Empire in 1908 had been ruled for 3 decades by a man who understood fear very well. Sultan Abdul Hamid II had built an apparatus of surveillance and silence, thousands of informers, a censor's office that could stop a newspaper on the street, a secret police that made dissidents disappear into prisons they rarely left. The reforms he permitted with one hand, he quietly strangled with the other. What he had not anticipated was that the men who would eventually remove him would come not from the palace's enemies, but from its own army. The Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, the organizational core of what the world called the Young Turks, had been building in the shadows of the military for years, recruiting officers convinced that their empire was capable of saving itself if only it were governed differently. They were not revolutionaries in any social sense. They did not want to tear down the empire. They wanted to modernize it, centralize it, give it the rational administration they had seen functioning in Germany and France. What they wanted in the end was a version of the Ottoman Empire that could survive in a world that no longer had patience for empires that couldn't pay their debts or win their wars. When the CUP came out into the open in July 1908, Abdul Hamid did not fight. He restored the constitution, called elections, and opened the parliament he had suspended 22 years earlier. Across the empire's cities, Salonica, Beirut, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Constantinople, communities that had spent a generation watching each other with suspicion found themselves briefly on the same side. Armenian parties that had operated underground sent delegates to parliament. Arab intellectuals argued for reform in newspapers the censor was no longer shutting down. There was a quality to this moment that people who lived through it spent years trying to describe. Not just political relief, but something closer to a room whose windows had been opened for the first time. The empire the CU had inherited was not merely autocratic, it was financially colonized. By 1914, the empire owed more money to European creditors than it could ever repay. And those same creditors had legal authority to collect directly from Ottoman tax receipts, customs duties, and state monopolies. The CUP could liberalize the political system as much as they liked, but they could not spend money already pledged to Paris and Berlin. The constitutional revolution had opened the parliament, it had not opened the treasury. And then the wars came. In 1911, Italy seized Ottoman Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. The following year, a coalition of Balkan states attacked from the north. For 5 centuries, the Ottomans had held Thrace, Macedonia, Albania, territories whose names carried the weight of imperial history. Within months, most of it was gone. By the end of 1913, the empire's European footprint had been reduced to a narrow strip of land around Constantinople. For the CUP, the Balkan Wars shattered the belief that had held the constitutional project together. Ottomanism, the idea that Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, and Turks could share a civic identity strong enough to hold a multi-ethnic empire, had rested on the assumption that the empire's subjects would choose it over the alternatives. Many of them would not. What replaced Ottomanism inside the CUP was something harder and narrower, the conviction that the empire's survival depended not on negotiating between its communities, but on the dominance of one of them. On January 23, 1913, Enver Pasha led 50 men to the Sublime Porte and forced the Grand Vizier to resign at gunpoint. The war minister died in the struggle. 3 men, Enver as Minister of War, Talaat as Minister of the Interior, Kemal as the Minister of the Navy, now held the controls of a state that had stood for 6 centuries. The question they were about to answer was which way to point it. The question was answered in the end by one man's certainty and one summer's chaos. When war broke out across Europe in August 1914, the Three Pashas understood the moment was both dangerous and potentially useful. Talaat had spent months attempting to negotiate an alliance with Russia and Britain. Both turned him down. Germany said yes, and Enver, who had served as military attaché in Berlin and admired what he saw there, made sure the answer came back quickly. The agreement was signed in secret on August 2, 1914. The Ottoman Empire was bound to Germany before its own cabinet had finished debating whether to enter the war at all. What followed was theatre designed to make the inevitable look like a provocation. 2 German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, were being pursued through the Mediterranean by the British fleet. They entered the Dardanelles and were nominally transferred to the Ottoman Navy, renamed and crewed by German sailors still wearing German uniforms. On October 29, 1914, this German squadron attacked Russian Black Sea ports under the command of a German admiral. Within a week, the Ottoman Empire was at war with Russia, Britain, and France. The cabinet learned the empire was at war the way most of its subjects did, from what was already happening. Enver had expected a swift German victory, quick enough to recover what the Balkan Wars had stripped away before the costs became impossible to bear. What he got instead was 4 years of fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously: the Caucasus, the Dardanelles, the Sinai, and Mesopotamia. With an army that lacked the industry to supply it, the roads to move it, and the reserves to replace what it lost. The first catastrophe was Enver's own. In December 1914, he personally led an offensive against Russian forces in the Caucasus Mountains in the depths of winter, convinced he could encircle them in the snow. Over the weeks that followed, approximately 78,000 Ottoman soldiers died, the majority not from Russian bullets but from frostbite and exhaustion, the consequence of an army marching beyond its supply lines into a season it was not prepared for. Enver returned to Constantinople and blamed the Armenians. That attribution of blame, unsubstantiated, convenient, and in the hands of a man who faced no institutional check on what he did with it, set in motion decisions whose scale is difficult to absorb. Through 1915, under orders coordinated by Talaat's interior ministry, Armenians across eastern Anatolia were subjected to mass deportations. The roads through the Syrian desert filled with columns of people who had been given hours to leave homes their families had occupied for generations. Between 800,000 and 1.5 million people died. From violence, from the conditions of forced movement, from the deliberate denial of food and water along routes chosen for what they would do to the people walking them. Talaat Pasha was tried in absentia after the war by an Ottoman military tribunal and sentenced to death for his role in it. He was already gone. In June 1916, Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the guardian of Mecca, a man whose authority derived from his descent from the Prophet, pushed a rifle through the window of his house and fired at the Ottoman garrison below. It was a symbolic shot, and it opened the Arab revolt. Hussein had been promised by the British that if he raised the Arabs against the Ottomans, Britain would support an independent Arab state across the bulk of the Arab-speaking world. That promise was simultaneously being contradicted by a secret agreement between Britain and France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the anticipated Ottoman Arab territories into their own spheres of influence. Hussein did not know about Sykes-Picot. The Bolsheviks, when they came to power in 1917, did, and they published it. For the ordinary inhabitants of the Arab provinces, the war arrived not as a military occupation but as hunger. In the mountain communities of what is now Lebanon, where around 200,000 people would die, 1/3 of the population, families who had lived on silk cultivation found their trade gone, their grain requisitioned by the Ottoman army, their coast blockaded by Allied navies, and their remaining crops stripped by a locust plague in 1915. The communities who survived called the First World War not by its political name, but by what it actually was, the War of Famine. Across Greater Syria, the death toll reached 500,000. There were no monuments built for them. Through all of this, one Ottoman officer was watching from the margins. Mustafa Kemal had severed his ties to the Three Pashas CUP in 1912, dissatisfied with their direction and personally at odds with Enver. He had distinguished himself at Gallipoli, the one front where the Ottomans held, by telling his soldiers they were not ordered to attack, but to die, and where dying had proven enough to halt the Allied advance. He was a general in an empire run by men he did not respect, fighting a war he had not chosen, and winning battles that were not changing what he could already see coming. What Kemal could see coming arrived in October 1918. The Ottoman fronts in Palestine and Mesopotamia had collapsed. On October 8th, Talaat announced his government's resignation. On the night of November 1st, he boarded a German torpedo boat with Enver, Kemal, and several other senior CUP figures, and disappeared into the dark of the Bosporus. They left behind no statement, no handover, no acknowledgement of what they had done or what it had cost. The Ottoman military tribunal that convened the following year tried them in absentia, found them guilty of bringing the empire into a war without legitimate cause, and of the mass deportation of Armenians, and sentenced them to death. None of them was present to hear it. The Armistice of Mudros, signed on October 30th, 1918, placed the surviving Ottoman state at the disposal of the Allied powers. Within months, British, French, Italian, and Greek forces were occupying different quarters of Constantinople and different stretches of Anatolia. The city that had been the capital of a 6th century empire was now administered from the offices of foreign generals. The Sultan who received them, Mehmet VI, understood that his survival depended on their goodwill, and he governed accordingly. The peace settlements the Allies imposed made the Treaty of Versailles look lenient. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920, proposed the partition of Anatolia itself. The Turkish heartland, carved into Greek, Armenian, French and Italian zones with a rump Turkish state left in a landlocked interior stripped of ports and revenue. The signatories were stripped of their citizenship by a rival assembly already forming in Ankara, which declared the document null before the ink was dry. While Anatolia was being divided on paper, the Arab world was being divided in practice, and the men who had fought the hardest to prevent it were discovering the full meaning of what they had been promised. Sharif Hussein found himself watching as the territories he had been told would form an Arab state were distributed between London and Paris along the Sykes-Picot lines. His son, Faisal, who had led Arab forces into Damascus and declared a constitutional monarchy there, was expelled by French forces in July 1920, 21 months after the armistice, thrown out of a country the French had decided was theirs. The British, honouring a different commitment, were simultaneously fulfilling the Balfour Declaration's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a territory that overlapped, in the Arab understanding, with what Hussein had been promised. Hussein had been told to trust the British had told the French, the Zionists and the Arabs 3 different versions of the future, and had been sincere with none of them. What emerged was not a settlement but an architecture of grievance. The borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Mandatory Palestine were drawn by 2 European governments balancing imperial interests across a map of a region most of their diplomats had never visited. When these borders produced the conflicts that immediately followed, Arab uprisings in Iraq in 1920, violence in Palestine in the same year, French bombardment of Damascus in 1925, they were treated in London and Paris as evidence of Arab disorder, rather than as the consequence of arrangements made without Arab consent. The same explanation was still being offered decades later. Talaat was walking along a street in Berlin on March 15, 1921, when Soghomon Tehlirian, a 24-year-old Armenian survivor who had watched his family die in 1915, stepped out from a doorway and shot him in the head. Tehlirian made no attempt to flee. He was arrested on the pavement, tried in a German court 2 months later, and acquitted. The jury had spent 2 days hearing testimony about what had happened in eastern Anatolia, and they took just over an hour to reach their verdict. It was the only public accounting the events of 1915 received in that generation, and it happened in a German courtroom rather than an Ottoman one, because the men responsible made sure they would never stand in any other kind. Kemal was assassinated in Tiflis in July 1922 by Armenian operatives under the same campaign, Operation Nemesis. Enver died in August 1922 in Central Asia, cut down by Red Army cavalry while leading an anti-Bolshevik insurgency, still trying to carve out a pan-Turkish empire in the east. He was 40 years old. While the Three Pashas were fleeing and dying in exile, the one man who had refused to follow them into the catastrophe was already back in Anatolia, building something from the wreckage. On May 19, 1919, a steamship called the Bandurma docked at the Black Sea port of Samsun. Among those who disembarked was Mustafa Kemal, carrying orders from the Sultan's government to restore order in the interior. He had no intention of restoring anything on the Sultan's behalf. What he intended was to organize what remained of the Ottoman military and political structure into something capable of refusing the peace settlement that was coming. He was not obviously well placed to succeed. The Allied powers occupied Constantinople. The Sultan's government was collaborating with them, issuing orders to local commanders to disarm and stand down. The Anatolian interior was exhausted, depopulated in places, and full of refugees from the Balkan Wars and the wartime deportations. When Kemal convened a nationalist congress at Sivas in September 1919, building a movement around the principle that Anatolia was not available for partition, he was making a claim the balance of military power did not obviously support. What he had, in place of the resources he lacked, was clarity. He had watched the Three Pashas make every consequential mistake available: the secret alliance, the reckless offensive, the purges that stripped the empire of communities it needed, the flight in the night that left everyone else to face the consequences. He understood that the empire was not going to be restored, and that attempting to restore it would only deepen the ruin. What could be saved was Anatolia. What could be built on Anatolia was a state, smaller, shorn of imperial ambition, but viable. On April 23, 1920, the Grand National Assembly opened in Ankara, 300 miles from the occupied capital, and declared itself the legitimate government of the Turkish nation. Kemal secured military aid from the Soviet Union and reorganized the nationalist forces into a functioning army. The Greek forces pressing into the Anatolian interior were the most immediate threat. The campaign ran through battles at Inari, at the Sakarya River, and finally the Great Offensive of August 1922, which shattered the Greek lines and drove the occupying army to the coast. By September 1922, the foreign forces were expelled. The war that had begun in 1914 with a German admiral attacking Russian ports was finally, in practical terms, over. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. Mehmet VI, the 36th and last Ottoman Sultan, successor to a dynasty that had ruled continuously since 1299, left Constantinople on HMS Malaya, a British warship, carrying what he could take with him. He went to Malta, then Italy, and died in San Remo in 1926. The institution he represented had been voted out of existence by men who had decided that 6 centuries of Ottoman history were no longer useful to them. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed on July 24, 1923, gave the new Turkish state what the empire had never managed to secure: recognized borders, the abolition of the capitulations, the system of foreign economic privileges in place for decades that had given European creditors the legal right to reach directly into Ottoman tax revenue, and international legitimacy. It was a more favorable settlement than the dismemberment of Sèvres, and it was the direct consequence of the military victory Kemal's forces had won. Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary who negotiated against the Turks' delegation, found the experience sufficiently frustrating that he described İsmet İnönü, Kemal's chief negotiator, as the most difficult man he had ever faced across a table. İsmet İnönü was partially deaf and had perfected the habit of removing his hearing aid whenever the British delegation said something he had decided not to hear. The price of Lausanne was written not in the treaty's articles but in the people it formalized into statistics. The Greek-Turkish population exchange required approximately 1.2 million Orthodox Christians to leave Anatolia, communities that had been there long before any Ottoman Sultan, and around 400,000 Muslims to leave Greece. Families who had spent generations in the same villages were told they belonged somewhere else and given weeks to get there. The exchange was described in diplomatic correspondence as an orderly solution to an intractable problem. For the people loading their belongings onto carts, it was the end of the world they had always lived in, exchanged for a country they had only ever been told was theirs. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in Ankara. Mustafa Kemal became its first president and spent the next 15 years building a secular, nationalist state designed in almost every particular to be the opposite of what the empire had been. Abolishing the caliphate, replacing Ottoman script with Latin letters, separating religious authority from the machinery of government. He took the name Atatürk. The Ottoman dynasty was expelled from the country entirely, and the palaces they had occupied were turned into museums. The men who drew the lines that ended the empire were mostly in offices in London and Paris. The borders they assigned to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine were finalized by people who had, in most cases, never visited them, drawn to satisfy competing promises and strategic interests rather than the populations who lived there. Those borders still stand. The arguments they produced have not stopped. The Ottoman Empire was not worn away by centuries of decline. It was destroyed in a decade by a small group of men who seized absolute power, made a catastrophic bet on the wrong war, and left behind a map of broken promises that the Middle East is still living inside. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which chapter we should cover next.